Welcome everybody, nice to meet you. Thanks for coming along. So as it says on this slide, what we're going to do today is learn about how to combat zombie myths about learning, or probably the more kind of serious title of it is use a bit more of an evidence-informed approach to boost your development as a coach. So just a quick show of hands to get us started. Have you ever heard of the idea of learning styles? Give us a hand up if you have. Okay, so yeah, that kind of matches sort of research in the UK, which found that 90% of coaches have kind of heard of this idea of learning styles. And the most common type of learning style that you might have heard of is called VAC or VARC, so visual, auditory, sometimes it's got reading and writing in there, or kinesthetic learners. So this is the idea that people learn best when stuff is kind of put across to them in line with their learning style, and the idea that people have a particular learning style that they learn best within. So we've got some pictures here to kind of illustrate that visually. So we've got visual learners here watching a game of rugby. The idea is that they would be learning best by watching. We've got auditory learners, so on the top left, people, oh no, I think that might be reading, isn't it? Auditory learners, bottom left, they're listening to the coach, and the idea is that they learn best by listening. Reading and writing, so top left, these players are kind of reading a bit of anti-doping legislation, so they're learning through so reading. And then bottom right, kinesthetics, learning by doing. And there's actually over 50 different types of learning styles inventories, and this is just one of them, but it's the most common. So what we're going to do is have a little go at filling in a VARC questionnaire. So the VARC one is the most common, as I said, and there's loads of different kind of things that are attached to it. If you go online, you can find lots of different studies, etc. But I'd like you to have a little go. So if you scan the QR code, you can just have one person on your group in your table doing that, and you can perhaps share, or you can do it yourself if you're feeling a little antisocial, or just kind of stick into Google the VARC questionnaire for athletes. Feel free to go and, if one person wants to do it, you can, as I said, do it in a group and have a little go, have a little look. So you should be able to pick an answer for each question, and then by the time you get to the end of it, it gives you a little score. So let me know if you're on there. Is it working? Okay, so I'll let you guys finish that off in your own time. But I think some people have got a few answers out of getting through the whole thing. So we had a mild kinesthetic over there, which sounds a bit like some kind of condition. So hope you're okay there, Bruce. Derek, what came out of your one? Everything. Yep. Okay. So you might have got, it might have been labelled a particular learning style after doing that questionnaire, or you might have got like a variety of them. And the idea behind this kind of VARC thing, you might have seen at the bottom as well, you can pay some money to get extra resources to help you learn better. So this is a little bit problematic, and we're going to start sort of poking some holes in this. So the idea is that in your group, so if you came out with kinesthetic learning, for example, you should be able to recall information more effectively if you were instructed in your preferred style. So let's take the line out session later on this afternoon, just because I love a line out. Thanks, Derek, for coaching me that. If you came out with kinesthetic as your preferred learning style, the idea is if you took part in that line out session as a player, then you would get to learn that better and be able to recall that information better later on down the line. If you came out as a visual learner, you might learn that line out information best, learn the new line out by viewing it, by watching it. If you came out as auditory, then the idea would be someone explaining to you that those line-out principles, then you would kind of learn that best and be able to remember that better. And if you came out as sort of reading, writing, maybe if someone wrote down the key points, wrote down the kind of strategy of the line-out, then you'd be able to remember that best or learn it best. But actually, there aren't any studies at all that have followed the design principles we need to be able to test that and show that it's the case, okay? So there's certainly none that are in sport that have tested these kind of hypotheses using the right designs. or the kind of predictions using the right designs. And there's certainly none that are to do with technical skill development. And that's kind of the business that we're in as coaches. We're here to kind of help improve our players and their technical skills, amongst other things. But there's no kind of academic evidence that follows the right design principles to tell us that matching someone's learning style to their preference, if they were to do a kind of questionnaire like you've just done, enhances their learning at all. So you might kind of say, is this a problem? Well, actually, yes, because you could be missing out on something else that is going to be even more effective for coaching your players and helping them to learn in a different way. And also, if you're kind of starting to box people into these kind of styles, saying, this player is a kinesthetic learner, so they have to do it to be able to learn it, they might actually be kind of missing out or not pushing themselves if they're comfortable the whole time. Sometimes there's a bit more evidence that being outside your comfort zone, doing something you're not that comfortable with, can be a bit better for your learning as well. So, learning styles, I'm going to conclude, are a zombie myth because they can be harmful. They replicate, they spread really easily, and also they refuse to die. They just keep coming back, even though we keep trying to kill them. And also, another kind of zombie aspect of them is when we talk about them more and more, trying to refute them, we can sometimes make them stronger, which is an absolute nightmare. So how are we going to try and combat these zombie myths? Well, actually, first of all, it's not all doom and gloom. If you're someone that sort of buys into this idea of learning styles, you kind of like them, it's not necessarily a bad thing. So they help us to focus on learning and our players learning, which is a good thing. And if you're someone that's really interested in learning, maybe an interest in neuroscience, that means you're actually more likely to buy into these kind of learning styles because you want to do the best for your players, right? You want to help them to learn. So we do have learning preferences. I have a preference for cake, but I can't just eat cake the whole time because it's not very healthy for me. I would love to just eat cake all the whole time, but it's not a balanced diet. And just like that, with learning styles, we need a kind of variety of different ways of getting the information across to create a kind of balanced diet for our players. And as I said, you're not alone if you kind of buy into this idea of matching the learning style to the player's kind of to the player's preference. Almost 2/3 of coaches in the UK said that they sort of bought into this idea of matching, which is, there's no evidence for it. And 57% of coaches in the UK came across these ideas on their core coaching courses, so like your level 1, level 2. When you're learning to be a coach, it's actually the national governing body's fault for sort of telling you that this is the way things are. So we can actually start to combat them by looking at ourselves as coaches and how we learn as well. So maybe we could use a bit of evidence to start to kind of get at these zombies and kind of start to pick them off. So I wanted to show you a little bit of an example of an evidence-informed kind of process for how you learn as a coach, or how you might learn as a coach. And this is based on my research, which was with football coaches, but hopefully, in explaining it, it'll give you a chance to reflect on your own learning and see if you pick up anything that might help you, give you something to think about. And recently, I kind of redesigned this. It's a theory that's based on evidence from following these football coaches over the course of a season through their national governing body kind of qualifications, and looking at their practice and asking them, so why do you do what you do? Where do you learn that from? And then building up all that evidence to create a process of how they learned. And I've re-represented it as a coffee filter. So the idea behind this, let me just explain. Your biography as a coach, so who you are, the sum of your values, beliefs, experiences, where you've grown up, things that you kind of really buy into, that makes up your biography. So it's like your baggage that you bring to any kind of situation. So everyone in here, in this room, you've all come from different places, you've all got different experiences, so that means you'll probably leave all having picked up different things from this session. And so if we can maybe be a bit more aware of these things as a coach, then that can help us to learn a bit better, perhaps. So in this kind of diagram, we've got biographies like this kind of coffee filter. And if you imagine you're kind of drinking your coffee, before you do that, it's got to be filtered through. So maybe if you come across something today in the conference, and it's something you already knew about, something you already believe in, you really buy into, it would just go straight through your biographical filter. Unfiltered, you're going to have a very full cup of coffee. It might not taste that good because it's not filtered out any of the rubbish. You've just taken everything on board and you're like, yeah, that's fine, that's me. Have you actually learned anything? Equally, you might have a really sort of tight filter. You might be not convinced by anything, and it might mismatch your biography. So it might be an idea that you really disagree with. You might completely disagree with everything that Gregor Townsend just said. You might think, nah, I don't think Scotland should be playing that way. Don't buy into that. So you've just filtered that out. So there's nothing in your coffee cup. You're not going to learn anything. But ideally, you've got something in the middle where this idea that you come across, perhaps in today's session, might sort of be between the two. It sort of fits in through your biography. So it's going to sort of drip through that filter and into your coffee cup, ready to be tried out and tested. So if we understand who we are as a coach, we understand our biography, then we can sort of be a little bit more aware of our personal learning biases and perhaps tweak them a little bit to maybe be a bit more open-minded. But equally, sometimes you do need a filter to filter out some of the bad stuff, like a zombie myth. But before you're ready to taste your coffee, you might need to try it out or adapt it for the context. And we'll go through and explain each of these stages with some examples right now. So before you try it out, yeah, the context, you've got to understand that, and you might need to tweak for your context. So again, using the example of Gregor Townsend's keynote, that's a different context from where most of you probably coach. This is the context that I coach in. It's at Cambridge University. And so I wouldn't be able to take all the things that Gregor Townsend said and just apply it to my team. He spoke really well about understanding what your team is, what their strengths are, and kind of tailoring to them. So I have to understand the context that I work in to be able to tweak that for myself, rather than just kind of think, oh, well, it's not relevant for me, I'm just going to bin all of that. So I'd like you to maybe have a think and a chat to the person next to you, or the people on your table, about your coaching context. So 2 questions. First of all, have you ever come across something on a conference or a coaching course where you've thought, that's a good idea, but it's not going to work in my context, and then just ditched it? And secondly, how does that context influence you and your coaching and your learning? So could you change anything there to mean that you could try more things out, or could you change like who you work with, or like involve somebody else? So 2 questions. First of all, someone tell me what the first question was. Can you remember? Yeah, something that you've picked up that you've maybe thought not relevant to my context and binned it. Second question. Sorry?
How does it influence you and your coaching if you've got something of an idea, and how would you use that to the group you're working with?
Yeah, so like have a think about your context and share that with the person next to you. Could you maybe change your context a little bit to help your learning? Off you go, you've got 5 minutes. Okay, so we'll listen up. Right, so it sounds like some good chats going on. Hopefully you got a good chance to speak to each other about different coaching contexts. Could I ask somebody from this table to maybe like share something that they talked about at all, please? Anybody? Be brave. Sitting at the back, I'm one of those. Yeah, really good example. So talking about when you're quite new to it, having like almost no filter, and it can get a bit of an overload. Yeah, I kind of experienced that on my level 3 coaching award, when I was just trying to do too much at one time and try too many new things at one time. And in the middle of the session, the coach developer said to me, "What's the aim of this session that you're leading?" And I was like, I don't know, I can't remember. And that's like the main thing that I'm meant to know, because it's just overload. So yeah, you sort of do need a bit of a filter. And yeah, maybe you could think about the context you work in. You mentioned the head coach. There's other people there that you could use to help you maybe sort of focus on what's important, or like someone to bounce ideas off and help you to narrow that down a little bit. So yeah, good example. What about this table at the back? Could maybe somebody just share one example of something you talked about? Okay, so another good example of like you're thinking this is a good idea, the example of kicking, yeah, I completely buy into that, but the team that I'm working with at the moment don't have those sort of skills necessary to they haven't developed those skills yet to be able to put those tactical things into practice. So yeah, a good example of the context that you're working in, kind of determining what you learn and what you're able to put into practice. So my clicking's not working. So once you've so you might need to adapt something to work in your context. That's the kind of point. So you could start to think about what things could I adapt. You could bring on board someone that you already work with, or kind of target someone to get them to help you. Or you could, target a extra coach for your players to work on that particular skill that needs to happen. So you need to adapt it. And bringing back the coffee metaphor, that might be putting in a little bit of milk, or maybe a bit of sugar to sweeten it up. And so coaches are the same. You might need to sort of adapt their ideas for your context before you're able to start to apply them. So it was just an idea to have a think about your context you're working in and whether you can adapt that a little bit to increase or improve your learning as a coach. And so the next kind of part of the process that these coaches I did my research on were talking about was this reflective conversation at the bottom, which I know is very small, you might not be able to see, but don't worry, I'm going to explain it. It's kind of like a circle, almost like a running track. And this was the process. It's not just a chat, a reflective conversation. It's actually the process whereby the coaches were trying out new ideas, experimenting with them, adapting them, and maybe adopting them and going again if it didn't quite work out. So it's a very practical kind of trying out process. And we are going to do a little example reflective conversation now as something that you might want to try out as a coach to help boost your learning based on evidence. So we're going to kind of pick on Gordon a little bit to go through a reflective conversation live. So this kind of starts with thinking about your team's development needs. So we've got an example of kicking skills. Or maybe you could do one about yourself, what your own needs as a coach. What do you want to develop? What would you like to try out, or what would you like to achieve in your coaching? And then it's all about generating the strategy, trying it out, experimenting with it, evaluating it, what worked, why, and then adapting it and go again. So this is going to be a bit of a conversation with Gordon. So yeah, Gordon, can you explain, first of all, what context you work in, please? And I'll get your videos up.
It's like a good double team. Coaching at the University of Edinburgh with the ladies team. And this was the first year I was coaching, so 6 years ago we took over a squad that was full of Scottish internationals, superstars. But one of the things we recognised really quickly is the game was very much dominated by those players. And for want of a better term, one of the projects that I said was I was going to bring the bottom closer to the top. So I was going to bring the newer players and the less experienced players a bit closer to the top. So we wanted to do it by a really heavy, decision-rich, game-based approach. Lots and lots of time on task and using constraints within the game to then challenge decisions and question players and develop the game understanding as opposed to perhaps just the following the superstars, if that makes sense. So about 80% of all our sessions were games. We've put the sound down because there's a lot of fat noises coming with me wearing a GoPro and running about.
Okay.
So.
Our passing's fantastic, and we're moving the ball along a static line brilliantly. We are getting some space out wide, but there can always be passing too much. Yeah? As soon as we get it, maybe 2 passes, the defence is a little bit wider. Now, we have just said, if you can hit a gap where 2 people have to turn in to tackle you, you can burst through that. So once it gets those 2 passes, you need to get your head up to see, can I get that gap, or should I move it another one? So it's that split decision you have to make. Is there space enough, so is there 3 or 4 metres gap, I can just get the head down, go through there and look for the offload. Because just now we're going pass, 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 pass. Lovely, great skills, but we could penetrate the line a lot more.
So you were trying out the kind of games-based learning. So do you want to talk through the intervention a little bit there, what you were trying out, and do you think it worked or not? Yeah.
So like we said, we wanted to really challenge the players, creating a constraint that would then encourage them to try and find a way to beat the game. So we're playing 2-touch game here, so the first touch you can continue running forward, try to find that space. If you get caught again, the ball must be then presented, but they can offload beyond the contact. So I wanted to try and make sure that they understood how to use the sort of rules to benefit their gameplay. And the interventions that we had in my head were all questions and helping them learn, but upon reflection are all just me talking and instructing. So, you know, when I watched this back, and Anne had challenged me a little bit about what to look for and stuff. A lot of good stuff there, but it wasn't necessarily what I intended on doing.
Do you think that the game works? So Gregor said was talking about like the rules that you put on the game, bringing out what you want to happen. Do you think that that's can you judge whether it works?
Yeah, so again, when I think about my own learning style, and I'm very kinesthetic and stuff, so if I hadn't had this video, I would have walked away thinking that was really, what a great game. There was loads of success, high levels of activity, which is obviously one of the things we wanted to achieve, and good information getting to the players. But in my head, because that was all happening, I was feeling it, it was super. Upon reflection, it was that we didn't necessarily develop better understanding, so we can't hear the sound here, but there's a lot of touch one, touch two that happens immediately after each other, which suggests to me that the players aren't figuring out how to play the game. If they were doing it properly, they would be finding better spaces to try and break the line. So it would be touch one, 2 or 3 seconds as they exploit the space, and then touch two. So yeah, in my head, it worked. Upon reflection, I'm ticking probably about 70 or 80% of what I tried to achieve, and perhaps the deeper understanding and the better decision makings weren't necessarily getting worked on because it was me talking. Great information by me, though.
So, let me just jump back here. So what would you adapt and go again? Sorry.
Yeah, so it's definitely the ability to watch myself on the video and understand that it wasn't quite what I wanted to achieve. It stimulated a lot of change in the way that we then ask questions. So what we adapt and go again, as we've learned over the years, is it's very little blow the whistle and me talk to the whole group. It's usually split into teams or into smaller groups, and the questions dropped to those players and they then answer. Now, whether we get the answer back from them or whether I just check that they are actually talking to each other and then allow them to show me rather than tell me. So that's probably the biggest learning from that point forward.
Thanks, Gordon. So you said, "Oh, I'm a kinesthetic learner," so I'm gonna challenge you a bit on that. So you learned there though through being able to watch it back, and you could hear it and you could see it on the video, and it's like and we were having that conversation, and you probably had a conversation with your head coach as well, maybe with some players about is this working or not, to evaluate it, go again. So it's actually much more complicated than, you know, yes, you can learn sort of kinesthetically by doing your coaching, but actually when we look at the evidence of how coaches learn, much more complex than that. And you need to kind of go through that process to create more meaningful learning rather than just kind of doing the same stuff over and over again, just getting stagnant and thinking, wow, this is great, I'm doing a great job here. Love this games-based coaching, it's working a treat, when it might not be working. There's sort of different things that need to happen to make it more powerful as a coaching intervention. So the idea is that once you've been through that reflective conversation process, we've just done a sort of mini one there, your biography has changed as a coach. So Gordon's given us an example of understanding now he needs to actually go in there and ask those questions a bit more. Maybe, did you think about trying to plan those questions beforehand? Like, how did you make sure that you did that in the future?
Yeah, the nature of the game that we play would lead to potentially what the problem the players would see. And if we understood that, we could plan an intervention. The first couple of questions were based on what we perceived that players may or may not see or do.
Yeah, cool. So starting to identify, maybe I need to pre-plan some of those questions so they're actually on my coaching plan or like on the match day plan. So then you remember to ask them. It seems really simple and obvious, but people quite often, or coaches quite often, don't plan what are you going to ask, plan your questions. Questions are really difficult to ask well, so why not plan them too? So perhaps your biography, well, I would hope, Gordon, that your biography has probably changed as a coach since those videos, because they're a couple of years back now. So that in turn acts as a filter for the next kind of learning experience, now that you've got that kind of practical knowledge of asking questions to help bring out game-based understanding in that context. And so you can see it's quite a complex process, but it's also always changing. It's a cycle. And that means that if you're following that, if you're sort of doing that as a coach, you're always changing and always learning as well. Whereas when we compare that back to the kind of visual, auditory, kinesthetic, they're quite static. You're like, you're in this box, or a lot of boxes if you're Derek, and it doesn't really give you a chance to think about being in different situations. You might learn differently in different situations. You might change the way that you learn as you sort of change as a coach. So how do we combat zombie myths about learning and use an evidence-informed approach to boost your development? Follow the steps. So knowing who you are as a coach. So yes, you might understand your preferences for information to be given to you, but then if you understand that, then you can understand maybe sometimes it's good to go outside of those preferences and try a different way. So yeah, I've got my biography. I enjoyed a line out as a player. I was coached lots of technical detail around it, which I enjoyed, and I enjoyed continuing to learn that. So I want to go to the line out session later this afternoon, but I don't know, maybe I'll push myself and go to something else just to sort of pick up a different way of going about it. Analyze the context that you work in, and maybe you could change some aspects of that. The coaches that I worked with in my research, some of them had like a really strict kind of curriculum that they had to work within in their clubs, and so they came across all these great ideas on coaching courses, but couldn't actually implement them because of the environment or the context they were working in. So could you, if you're in that situation, work more to change that context? Perhaps working with the people that you are kind of alongside, head coaches, etc. Could you sort of influence them to open up that context to try out more things? Strip it and flip it. So that relates to like any sort of new idea you come across, and you could use this today. Strip down the idea, maybe try purposely to see it from a different point of view. So flip your kind of perspective of it, or maybe speak to someone else that's next to you and think like, are you getting the same kind of perspective on this? They're probably not, because they're a different person to you. Think about how you could adopt it in your context, or maybe adapt it for your context, or just reject it. That's okay too. As we talked about, sometimes if you have no filter whatsoever, it's just a bit overwhelming. You can't learn everything. You might need to just pick one thing that you think is going to be important to try out, and then you can move on to a different thing. And then lastly, yeah, trying it out and involve others is normally quite helpful. So yes, you can identify different ways to adapt what you're doing and try out new things, but sometimes it is helpful to involve somebody else for that reflective conversation. They can suggest ideas to try out. They can suggest adaptations. They might be able to pick up things that you haven't seen. And if you video yourself, it can be quite an emotional process, so thank you, Gordon, for putting yourself through that in front of a whole room of people. But it is a very powerful way, like lots of researchers use that kind of as a data collection technique, but also it kind of acts almost like an intervention in itself. So you can do it just with, even, you don't have to video yourself, you can just get your phone and your like headphones and press record and just record what you say during a coaching session. You would probably get similar learning to what you were just talking about there, Gordon. You would hear, maybe if you'd intended to ask some questions, you might not have done it, and then you would realise from just having the audio. Or sometimes I have a tendency to ask questions like the whole group, and then it just condescends into sort of all sorts of over-analysis, and we're just like, come on, let's get on with it. So yeah, perhaps record yourself or involve others to kind of enhance that reflective conversation. So that's pretty much it. Hopefully you've got some tools now to help you combat those zombies. And a lot of the ideas in this kind of presentation are from this Urban Myths About Learning and Education book, which is I really enjoy it. So recommend that as follow-up reading if you're interested in this and other myths. Some other popular ones are those pyramids, also known as the Loch Ness Monster of learning styles theory, of learning theory, in that it keeps coming back as well. So if you like zombies, maybe you like Loch Ness Monster as well. And I've written this up in a chapter in the Myths of Sport Coaching book, edited by Dr. Amy Whitehead and Jenny Coe. That's also a really good book with lots of other chapters about different kind of myths within sport coaching, so more relevant to sport. Stuff about 10,000 hours, stuff about coaching women versus men, and whether that's a stepping stone or not, and different ways that women's sport is perceived as opposed to men's sport. Loads of different interesting things to dip into from lots of different authors who are experts. I do a little podcast with Derek, who's sitting here, called the Coaching Discourse Podcast. We haven't talked about learning styles yet. Maybe we'll have to, so you can have a look at that or listen to that if you're an auditory learner. And I've recently kind of published the coffee filter stuff in the UK Coaching Applied Research Journal. We've just done like a relaunch of that journal, and it's free to access. All you have to do is, if you want to scan that QR code, is up there, but you can just also Google UK Coaching Applied Research Journal, and there's some interesting things there. It's designed to be a bit more accessible than your traditional kind of academic research, which sometimes is quite difficult to kind of plough through everything and make sense of it as a coach. But this was designed to be a bit more accessible, and if you want to look at the coffee filter thing, because it was quite small in the slides, then you can do so. So that's me, and that means that we've got kind of like 10 minutes or so for questions or discussions, or you can just like sprint off and be first in the lunch queue. So any sort of questions or thoughts or reflections to get us started? Oh, go on.
Yeah, I've got a question. You mentioned there 10,000 hours. What's your viewpoint?
Okay, I'm not an expert on 10,000 hours, but I think that Malcolm Gladwell kind of took that and made it like the rule. So he talks about it as the rule that you must make 10,000 hours of practice to become an expert. But it's not actually when you strip it and flip it, when you strip it down to what evidence is there for it. All the evidence comes from, well, not all the evidence, but most of the evidence comes from like musicians, chess players, and you have to start to think to yourself, how relevant is that to my context? And also, the 10,000 hours was an average across lots of people who kind of retrospectively rated how many hours they spent on these things. So yeah, if I was to ask you, like, how many hours have you spent coaching, it would be quite difficult to remember, probably, quite difficult to work it out. So it's probably not the most sort of accurate way of sort of creating a rule that everyone should abide by. So I think that's a good example of like just using more evidence-based kind of approach to your coaching, really. But I would not claim to be an expert on 10,000 hours. Go and have a look at Amy Whitehead's book and Jenny Coe's book, and there's a chapter on that. What are your thoughts on it?
I think Gladwell, as you said, has created this idea, and it was based on, as you said, chess players, musicians, but it's never been recorded from start to finish, has it? They had to guess all the amount of time was spent. They had to think back to their adolescence and things. I know a guy quit his job and tried to do it as a professional golfer. I don't know if you read about that.
Yeah.
He got really close. I think he did over 10,000 hours, and he got really close to getting on the PGA Tour, but it didn't work out. So that's your evidence right there. It didn't work, but it's going to be, it's not, I suppose, it's not one size fits all. Someone will get better quicker and than 10,000 hours. Someone will potentially longer than 10,000 hours. I'm assuming you've probably read Outliers by Gladwell.
I've seen it, yeah.
It's dangerous, I suppose, to apply to try and apply that to coaching. But I mean, yeah, as you said, what was the term here? Strip it and flip it, see what works. 10,000 hours might be bang on for somebody, but I'm not discrediting Malcolm Gladwell at all. Great book.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I think 10,000 hours is a good example of like another thing, just like learning styles, where it sort of simplifies something that's a lot more complex, and it seems to make sense. So people are like, oh, great, like this is a difficult thing, and I've got something here that's like a rule that will help make things simple. And so that's fine to give you the idea, but we can be better than that, because we might be missing something that's more effective. And that's what makes all sort of myths, like zombie myths in particular, so sort of alluring. They're kind of simple and sort of easy to get on board with, but actually we could strip it and flip it, get a little bit deeper with some of our evidence perhaps, and be more effective as a coach then. So yeah, that's my thoughts. Go on.
How much weight do you put on learning styles then? And should we be paying attention to different types of learning styles? If you're saying that should we pay attention to it?
Okay, so the question is like, should we bother paying attention to learning styles? I think, as I said earlier, they're quite useful in that they make us think about learning, which is a good thing. And if you're applying them to players, it's useful to help you to think about how you get information across, but perhaps getting it across in like lots of different ways. There's some evidence for dual coding, which is the being able to hear something and see it. So this is kind of like a presentation style. Because you've got two different ways of getting the information, it means you're more likely to be able to remember it in future. So they're useful to think about in terms of how you get the information across as a coach. But they also have, if you have a look at my chapter, when I looked into where they come from, there's some pretty problematic, racially linked kind of things that learning styles came from. That's where they were started to be used. I think that's a bit problematic, and I'd rather use something that's actually based on evidence in my practice, because, as I said, there's problematic underpinnings, and there could be better ways. They're actually based on evidence. So that's my thoughts.
What do you think of the overall, in this case, the SRU's governing body? I recently did the Basics Essentials course, and that very much sets out the philosophy of not only what SRU want to see as a coach, kind of what the philosophy that they want the Scottish game to be going forward, and a very much games-based approach. And I think one of the takeaways for me is that it's got to be dynamic. And for me, I was interested in this today because I've never really came across these terms and things like that as a new coach. But the one thing I can say is that it's really highlighted to me that you've got to. I've got 20 boys at times, and we kind of all coach them the same way, because some kids just won't switch on to that. Some kids want to be spoken to one-to-one. Some kids, it's the worst thing in the world if they could have to. So it's having that adaptability, I think, would be the key takeaway, and understanding that, as you say, those 4 different ways of doing things may work, but in context, and especially on a Tuesday night, and it's pissing down, it's November, and it's cold, you know. I mean, the one they don't really, most of the boys don't know what to sit down and have a chat about it. They'll just want to keep running about, you know, and trying to, how we deal with that and get the message across that's probably one of the things I'd be most interested in going forward.
Did you see we're doing it right or doing it wrong?
No, I think you're doing it right.
I wrote the course.
Gordon's having a rough morning. He's under the spotlight. Thanks for your reflections. That's a very reflective kind of, reflective kind of thoughts on your experiences so far learning as a coach. So yeah, that you're saying about the environment, that links to the context as well, and all coaching is situation and context specific. So you would change depending on the weather. If it's like pushing it down, you're not going to all sit down like on the ground and like listen to the coach, or like show kind of a whiteboard demonstration where everyone's sitting. So yeah, it depends on the situation. So I think it's just about thinking about how you get the information across and getting it, having like a spread of different things. So maybe if you do a more kinesthetically kind of based session in that situation, make sure perhaps that you could follow up with like a written down sort of version of whatever you've focused on, so people can look at that in their own time, or do another session when the weather's better, a different way. So yeah, it's just a useful tool to get you to think about how you get the information across. The hand up here, and then over there.
So I do a specific at my school that I work in for kids with autism. Have you done any of your research on anything with kids that have got learning disabilities, or even adults with that type of thing?
I have not, but there's a great researcher called Rob Townsend. He works at Waikato in New Zealand, and his PhD was with the same supervisor as mine, Chris Cushion, and that's to do with coach education related to coaching for autism, and there's some really interesting stuff on there. So No, I cannot. I cannot provide that. But yeah, go and look at Rob Townsend because he's got some really, really good research on that area. Yeah, and it's more about coaches learning than about like participants learning. That yeah, I couldn't claim to be an expert on like how players learn. So so there's a question over here. Oh, nice. check out Rob Townsend. He's cool. Anything else? Another question or no? Just a stretch. Right, 12 o'clock. What's the schedule, Gordon?
It's a big lunch. The grab and go means the more you get, the time it, the better you.
Do you want the mic?
No, not really.
No, you're getting it anyway.
Tell a joke, kill some time. Just like a massive thank you for Anna. It's not often, when you come on a coaching conference, there's a session focused on you as a coach. It's usually something that you can go and give to your players. So an opportunity, I mean, this information is pertinent to how you deliver as well, but for you and your learning. So it's awesome time to get a bit of reflection as well. So I hope you found that really useful. And we'll share some of the links to the books and the authors and the research as well. And if you really want to geek out, you can get away and read some of that and take a deep dive into your own practice. So if you want to join me in just thanking Anna very much for that session.